So good morning, everybody in TLDC land, and we're glad that you guys joined us today. I had a screen share up, which evidently is causing a problem on that echo, I think. So I don't know if we were looping back on the sound or not, but you know, we learn as we go, right? And actually, you know what? Bejanae, here's an idea. I don't know if Luis might be able to do anything on the screen share or help us out, but you could actually share that document to him, because that might be an idea here. I've screen shared. Bejanae's actually screen shared before, and we never had a problem with it before. So there you go. So anyway, today I'm here with Bejanae Kareem, and she actually she's been on with us before. So just to summarize really quickly, like what I know of her is she is just an amazing person when it comes to all things the teachers do in terms of supporting their classrooms. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but she is essentially a kind of a STEM, science, technology, education, engineering, arts, STEAM, and math guru when it comes to working with classroom teachers and getting them into those concepts and getting them into that kind of that groove of working with students on STEAM education. And she also teaches on how to get grants for classrooms. And so that's why we're here today. So just briefly, our audience is really varied. We have people from like pretty much anything you can think of in the area that touches, learning or development. We have people who are analytics people, we have teachers, we have instructional designers, and so we have such a broad audience that we decided to go ahead and ask you to come in today, because I know that you have just written a book on 12 steps to grant writing for teachers. I don't look at that as necessarily a grant writing process that's just isolated for teachers and maybe others who want classroom support. So anyway, without further ado, I will have Bejanae introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background, because she has a pretty impressive background. She's done some pretty amazing things. So I'll let you go with it. I'll see if I can possibly screen share again. I don't know. We'll go with it.
And I'll try it too. Hold on one second. Let's see if it works. Let's see. Fingers crossed.
It's working for you. There you go. Wasn't working for me, but it's working for you. Yay!
Yay. That's okay. Technology and teamwork.
All right. Cool.
All right. So just a little bit about myself. Thank you so much, Toddi, for the warm welcome. And I'm always excited to be able to participate with TLD Cast. Like, you all are such an amazing group. And I'm grateful to hear and glad to hear that we have a variety of folks in the audience, because being able to fundraise and grant rights really goes across a variety of industries, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can make those connections, right? So as you see here, I'm the executive director of BK International Education Consultancy. We are the education and grant specialist. And just a little bit about my background over to the right. I started off in the science industry, right, as you mentioned. So went to school for biology and chemistry, transitioned into the wonderful world of education, where I married my two loves of education and science, and also obtained a leadership degree as well. And so the book, or the steps that included in 12 Quick Steps to Writing Winning Grants, really merges those two loves. It unpacks the science of grant writing that's easy for any educator, instructional designer, curriculum designer, talent and development, coordinator would be able to respond and relate to. And so one of my passions is professional learning experiences, which I think most of us do have that passion as well. And then whenever it's safe to do so, again, traveling abroad is also one of my passions. It's just a great way to grow professionally and personally, and to develop like cultural competency and sensitivity. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, no, I would second that. I have to say that I started traveling in my early 30s. And, you just don't have that perspective, I think, until you do get outside of your own borders. And, I did crazy things with my kids when my daughter was in junior high. We did what I called the whirlwind eco tour I took her out of school. Yeah,
wow.
I did that. And I had her over with me in Europe, and I had her in a number of countries that had, electric powered trains. So, we were there for touring, but we were also there to really get a view of what, other countries were doing in terms of, climate effects and things like that. And then on the way back, she and I went through Iceland. So we spent about a day and a half in Iceland.
I'm so jealous.
Amazing. We did a quick tour, of some of the geothermal uses in Iceland, which, everything is pretty much geothermal powered there. Came home, I think we were home for a week, and then we ended up going down to the Caribbean, down to St. John, where there is an ecotourism campsite. And so we spent our week living off the grid on the side of a hill in a cabin that was solar powered and with a composting toilet. So, that was what we did. And so the great, essentially the climate focused tour.
So you had a STEM tour is what you had abroad. I love it.
It was so cool. And, it's like I was not apologetic at all to, my child's school, because I felt like the things that she had seen and experienced were just amazing compared to what, she would have been doing in a classroom during that time. So, yeah. And she's my little smarty. So not to say my son's not smart. He can be smart, but in a different way. But my daughter, she actually works in science. So it's pretty cool. Awesome. Go ahead.
No, but that's great. You're bringing the learning to life, right? Bridging the theory to real life experiences. Yeah, you can't.
Which is exactly what we're doing in the classroom. So
exactly.
Very cool. So, I mean, the questions that I have are, when it comes to grant writing, like, where does a person start? Okay, because like I remember years ago picking up a book on grant writing and thinking to myself, okay, well, first of all, how do I find grants? Like, how do I write for a grant? Like, what criteria do I have to meet? Do I have to manage that money? I assume I do. And of course, now we've been impacted by COVID, and no time in my history, and probably anybody's history, have we seen scenarios where, teachers are having to do things so much differently in classrooms and online. So, these are all unknowns. So I'll let you begin. And I mean, I know you actually have a lot of interesting facts. So, I'll let you start there and maybe give us some insight. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would like to do is just share a little bit, just a couple of questions for the audience, just to get them engaged as well, about their understanding about the education landscape in the U.S. So a question for the audience, the first question, even though it says question number 2, is what % of U.S. public school teachers spend personal funds on instructional materials? And so this was really the catalyst for me in sharing these gems about grant writing in the education space. So in the chat box, what % of U.S. public school teachers spend personal funds on instructional materials? So I'm curious as to what people's thoughts are. Ooh, so I see 100%. I see 100%. Sounds like we might have some educators in the house here. I see 80%. Okay.
And I see Avi. So Avi is my former coworker at Sierra Nevada Corporation. Avi. Anyway.
Right. And Louise said if not 100%, it'll be pretty close. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the percentage, according to the U.S. Department of Education, a survey given out to U.S. public school teachers, self-reported, 94% spent out of their personal funds. So this was back in 2018, 2019. So this has increased even higher since the COVID pandemic, right? So this has increased even higher than the 94%. And so this is not even including charter schools or private schools and things of that nature. This is just U.S. public schools, 94%. That is, I think that's just mind blowing to me. That is mind blowing to me. I have another question for the audience. Oh, I'm sorry, Toddi, what were you saying?
What's that?
Oh, I thought you were saying something.
Oh, no, just nodding my head because it's just overwhelming to me.
Right, exactly. And so I was an educator myself for over 10 years. And so I was tired of spending my own money in the classroom, and not because I didn't care about the kids, but it's like, okay, there has to be a better way. And so I started grant writing. Pretty much, I just started grant writing. And so I also am curious from the audience, how much do they think was awarded in grants in 2019? So if you go back pre-COVID, 2019, how much grant money is out there or was awarded? Anybody know in the audience, in the chat box? How much money?
I'm just going to put my guess out there.
Ooh, I see 100 million. I see billions. Okay.
Wow. I feel like this is one of those things, like, you know, when you go to college, they tell you that there's all these great scholarships that go unawarded. And I feel like this is probably the same thing with grants, that there's money, but people don't know about it.
That's exactly correct. And that, I believe, was the reason why I was successful in grant writing as a classroom educator, is because I did have some experience with scholarship writing from an undergraduate degree. And so again, there's a thread here, right? Like, okay, how are these things similar? What does scholarship writing and grant writing have to do with each other? All right. So how much grant money was awarded?
Oh my gosh. Are you kidding me?
400 billion plus.
Oh my gosh. That like gives me the chills just to think about how much money's out there.
Right. Now, I have to say a caveat there. Now, the money that was awarded, it is based off of a variety of complexity of grant levels, right? So you have federal grants, there are state level grants, there are local grants. But just to know that there is $400+ billion out there that people can tap into,
Wow.
why not? Why not?
That could solve a lot of issues.
Absolutely.
Oh, crazy. Okay.
Yeah. Think about now, some schools are hybrid. So having to acquire, PPE, personal protective equipment, Lysol hand sanitizer, or if you want to do fun and engaging STEM-based activities or grow your, maybe a virtual or a digital library for parents, so they have resources at home, or physical copies of books. Like, these are all projects, all needs that can be utilized for the basis of a grant project.
Yeah, at the beginning of COVID, I ended up talking to a Boston group that was busy getting together science kits, and plus, materials and books and whatnot to get out into the hands of students in, kind of a geographic area for exactly that type of thing, to really push forward, kind of this whole mindset of coming together online to do these collaborative, STEM experiments or projects, which, of course requires parental help too, and that's one of the biggest issues I think we've seen with this, is that, most parents are two parent working households, so there's not always a parent there who can help with all of that. So that the fact that you're mentioning parental resources, I think, is really important, because that's one of the things that we've been forgetting in this whole mess is, how can we support the parents out there? Because, the kids are having a rough time, but so are the parents. They're doing everything,
Right. And then it varies by community, because there are a lot of communities with two-parent households, and there are some that are not. So if you don't have two parents, then it's even more, it could be even more of a challenge, right, on providing support. So yeah, exactly. So let's tap into that $400+ billion.
Yeah, no kidding.
Great things in education. All right. Another question for you all, and this will lead into the question that you asked earlier, like, how do we get started with grant writing in education? So when looking at a grant proposal, and I'm going to use the word lesson plan, right? So that could be if you're a classroom teacher or instructional designer, right? If you're looking at the two, what is different? What is not there? So what does a lesson plan use that a grant proposal does not. So is it A, budget, B, differentiation, C, evaluation, or D, goals and objectives? What would you find in a lesson plan that you wouldn't find in a grant proposal? And we'll talk about why this is important in a second.
I would guess a budget. I say that just because I've so many times been given no budget to develop learning materials.
Yeah. That's a real fact, right? That's a real challenge. All right, so I'm seeing in the chat box differentiation. I'm seeing B. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So the answers are going through. Yes, differentiation is correct. So having a quality lesson plan or unit should include some level of differentiation. But B, C, and D, you will find in a grant proposal. And so we'll talk about that in 1 second. I want to talk about the connection between the two. So as an instructional designer, what does instructional design have to do with grants, right? So I'm breaking it down here for you in a Venn diagram, my favorite. Venn diagrams, they can compare like two concepts, right? They show you how things are different, how things are similar. On the left side, we have the lesson plan. On the right side, we have the grant application. And if you notice in the middle, there are so many similarities between a lesson plan and a grant application.
Mm-hmm.
So both should start off with the need. So to answer your question you had mentioned earlier, where do you go get started? Where do you find funding? You don't start with the funding in mind first. You start with the need. So what is the need of your target audience? So that rings true for a grant application or for a lesson plan. What are the needs for your learners? What are the needs of your target group? And then you go into designing goals and objectives, activities, a timeline, evaluation, metrics, and then materials. What materials are you going to need, for your lesson or for your grant application to be successful and to change whatever behaviors or perceptions of your learners or target groups, right? The two things that are different are in a lesson plan, it should include some level of differentiation, right? How can you scaffold this for different types of learners, whether it's maybe a visual learner versus a kinesthetic learner, right? Or in the classrooms, you're thinking about, students who have special needs accommodations, right? Or have individualized education plans, or if they're gifted, or if they're language learners, like all those things, all those considerations. But in a grant application, as you mentioned earlier, while a lesson plan may require some funds that oftentimes they do for those materials, that is normally a budget is not written into a lesson plan. But for a grant application, you would spec out, a budget, everything from personnel to those materials and things. So this is the connection that I wanted to show everybody, that those out there in TLD CAS land, if you're an instructional designer, curriculum designer, in talented development, or a classroom teacher like I was, you can leverage the skills that you already have a foundation in to be able to acquire funds.
One question, if you are doing a needs analysis and you come forth and you say, okay, I have this need, do you have to validate that need in any way? I think about that from the perspective of, like public funding. I mean, if we fund something publicly, we normally have to validate that there's an actual need there. Is there any requirement for that? Or are you just able to say, okay, this is my need?
Yeah, so it's going to vary depending on the funder. So as I mentioned earlier, grants complexity can vary, right? Depending on who's funding it and what the requirements are. Typically for classroom grants, they are a little bit more relaxed. But you should use best practices in terms of providing data and the data source for the need. So, so for example, when I was in a classroom, I wrote a grant for books for boys specifically, because I qualitatively or anecdotally noticed, like, oh, it was a struggle getting some of my boy students to read, right? And I was like, okay, what I'm always thinking about process improvement. So what can we do to engage the learners. How can I shift the learning space? So thinking about what am I offering first, instead of just pushing it on like, oh, it's something wrong with the students, right? So what can I do to change the learning space?
Sure.
And so at the time, graphic novels were becoming popular. And so these are books that look like comic books. But they, they're engaging, they're fun, they're animated, they include pictures for those visual learners, and it still has text, great level appropriate text. So I wrote a campaign to get books for boys. And it was based on the needs. So I could show, test scores, and I could also write I included my anecdotal notes for that particular grant project.
Yeah, and if you're lucky, you can find research as well to back it up. So very cool. I have to say, I just learned about something new that I didn't know about because I'm not a classroom teacher. Is Google Scholar, to be able to find research and publications. So I'm like, that's kind of a new tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can definitely find research out there. And again, it depends on the level of complexity of the grant. Like always starting with the need based on data. So you have a claim, this is your need. How do you know what's your evidence, which is your data? If you're going to research, sure, not throw it in there, but yeah, provide that. But yeah, as you get into more complex grants, federal grants, yeah, that definitely will probably be a baseline as a requirement, depending on the type of project.
Okay, interesting.
Yep.
Very cool.
Great question.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't typically think about the grant process as being so close to what we normally do when people like myself or my friend Avi out there, we had to write, needs analysis for the things that, we produce in, the corporate world. But you would have to do the same thing, to basically justify what you're asking for in a grant. So it's a good overlap here. And I think most of us are actually pretty, we're comfortable writing about these things, and really kind of proving the concepts out. So, All right. So now we get to the steps. So I know you have steps, so it looks like you got a couple you're going to show us.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned about the needs analysis because, as I mentioned before, you don't start, looking for the money first. You first find out what your needs are first, and then you find a funder that has a mission in support of what those needs may be. So there are 12 steps, and the 12 quick steps to writing winning grants, of course. And here are the first 3, and they all have to do with data. And so you can do this a variety of different ways. I say start with, collecting data, analyze the data, seeing kind of what stands out, if there are any themes, trends that you're noticing. If there's any way to unpack that further, it's helpful because sometimes data is one-dimensional. You may not get as to the why, what you're seeing, right? And then based on the data that you have and looking at trends and themes and things of that nature, set on what you want, the one thing that you want to focus and target on. I think, a lot of times, well, let me say for myself, as an educator, we have a variety of things to multitask and juggle. And even in designing lesson plans, we throw a lot of standards in there. And it's like, well, can you really cover all those standards? So I would recommend start simple. Just start simple. Start with one area that you want to focus on for helping to support learners. So focus on one need that you want to address. And as you get more experience under your belt, then add some more things to that. But keep it simple. Start simple.
Okay. And actually, you bring up a question that I had for you as well. Is like, is that part of what you need to do for maybe certain grants is to identify the standards? There's a couple different standards out there for classrooms. In Massachusetts, we use Common Core. There's are those things that have to be part of your identification that aligns to your needs analysis?
So here's the thing. Again, it's going to vary by who the funder is.
Okay.
So it's helpful as an educator, even if it's not required, that whoever is writing for the grant project or who is ever lesson designing or instructional designing is clear about what that is. And you can use that language in your grant. I don't know that you necessarily have to include like, oh, this is Massachusetts standard, 3.5 dash element. I don't think you necessarily have to do that, because whoever is reviewing the grant, they may not be an educator themselves.
Okay, good point.
They may not be an educator. They may come from a different background, so that may not necessarily resonate with them.
Okay.
But definitely connecting the standard to the need would make sense for your project rollout.
Okay.
Yeah.
So persuasive, I guess, more than necessarily referring back to standards. And I hadn't really thought about the fact that somebody might just be, might just go.
Yeah. So you definitely want to be mindful of, like, in every industry we have acronyms we use, right? So definitely be mindful of not just throwing out acronyms if you haven't defined or spelled out what those acronyms are, because again, whoever's reviewing the grant, who knows what background that they have. And so, taking the CRCT or whatever may not mean anything. So the same thing that we tell students when we're having them to write and practice their writing and write for us is make sure that it's clear, and being mindful of your target audience. So even though you may know it, you want to make sure that you break it down so it's clear.
Okay, interesting. All right, so 12 steps. So tell us more about like your book.
Yeah.
I actually have a copy. I did. Yeah. I'm like, I want to know more about this. And I'm sure, because you've boiled it down to what you're calling 12 simple steps. And I think, okay, within each of those steps is definitely some more complex processes. And I'm thinking about the amount of time that a teacher or somebody who's doing classroom grant writing would spend, to get this money in-house to be able to utilize. So, kudos to you for doing this, because, again, like I said, I wouldn't know where to start. I'm a pretty good writer, and I'm a strong writer for persuasive arguments, and obviously I can write a curriculum plan, but I wouldn't have thought about this. So this is a good guidepost.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to do, is just to let folks, well, not let folks, but definitely educators, instructional designers just know, like, hey, this is something you already have a skill. Like, you can bridge what you're doing over here into this other area if you so desire. So I'm glad that you have a copy. I have a copy right there. And I have a workbook that's available. The hard book will be coming out fairly soon, but I like the workbook because it's simple to read. It's not like a gazillion pages. I know educators don't have a lot. They don't have a lot of time, right? And you can write in the book. It's workbook style. It has comprehension checks embedded in there as we go over content. There's colored graphics. So the graphic that I showed you earlier is in there as well as the full step. So it's just a great reference. If you want to highlight and tab and come back to later, it's there for you to be able to do so and make it your own. So.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm excited about it, because I've been wanting to write some and ask for some grants for some very specific things that I'm interested in. And I'm not a classroom teacher, but I'm hoping to fill some needs. So
that's correct. That's right. And guess what? As I mentioned earlier, I realized that scholarship writing and grant writing are similar, right? Same thing with needs analysis, designing lessons, curriculum, things of that nature. And as you start to continue to write them, you know they're asking the same questions. And this is for education grants. This is for nonprofit grants. This is for small business grants. They ask the same type of questions.
That's a really good point. And it all starts with the writing skill and the ability to construct an argument, which, I have to say, the folks that are a part of this crowd at TLDC, I think that that's one of our strong suits that we probably don't talk enough about. I think we have a really great collective pool of strong writers. So, those are things we can all leverage on this. And think about it too. It's like, if I wanted to volunteer for a school, like one thing I could offer to do is to start applying for grants and do grant writing. I actually still volunteer with my daughter's charter school, just because
amazing.
They serve an amazing need in the community. They actively take on kids that have special needs, and so, I'm just thinking, I've never considered the idea of helping them, write for grants. So
yeah, absolutely, a great way to volunteer, and I'm more than sure that that the schools would be welcome will welcome that skill set that you have, especially given now there's a lot of budget cuts with schools.
Yeah, it's been crazy. Well, and so that's another question I have is like, first of all, where does a person find these? Like, how do you start finding the grants? Like, is it just, is it Google searching? Are there places where they might be listed? And next question is, are there things now available just for COVID needs? I would assume so, but I'm thinking, people probably had to scramble in terms of their grant offerings. So I'll leave those two questions there.
Yeah. So the answer is yes and yes. Yes, you can go on Google and start to find grants, any and all kind of grants,
Okay.
As well as, yes, there are also COVID-based grants as well. Okay. So there are, the philanthropic community notices that there is a need because of COVID, and so they are shifting their funding priorities to help support communities in that area. Even in the small business area, nonprofit area, education area, like there are tons of COVID relief grants is what they're calling them. Money is coming down from federal, trickling on down to state level, even foundations. And what is also popular in the education space is, we've seen a boom in the use of educational technology because we've been forced to, right? Because we want to keep safe, and we're working from home. And so there are also a lot of opportunities in that arena too, to help support pivot support learning virtually and online. So those are two.
So, and I'm thinking about that too, because there are people coming forth now because of COVID who are starting to offer services as well, looking at what the needs are. I mean, we know the needs are many, but one of the critical needs is obviously for support for parents, for support for kids. If someone had like a skill set that they hadn't used in a while and they wanted to start supporting families, maybe for special services or something, would they possibly be eligible to also apply for grants? Say, I don't know, maybe they're offering speech services or something like that.
So the great thing is that there are grants for almost any and everything. So there are grants available for teachers.
Okay.
There are grants available for schools. There are grants available for higher institutions of learning. There are grants available for nonprofits. There are grants available for individuals. There are grants available for small businesses. So it's just a matter of being able to find them. But yeah, a great place to start is Google. But there are also what they call funding alert sites as well. Just like if you're applying for, or you're looking for jobs, say you're searching for jobs, and instead of going on every day, you sign up for a job listing alert based on like your keyword criteria. They have some grant alert sites that will do that as well. Now, the caveat is that, some of those are fee-based. You would have to pay a fee for those. But if you start in Google, it's a free place to start, as well as crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is another place to start as well. So crowdfunding is simply just what it says. There's a crowd of people who are funding their project, and it usually happens on an online platform. So most people have heard of GoFundMe, right? Yep. So GoFundMe is an example of crowdfunding, and I would classify that as a grant because you wouldn't have to pay it back. You would have to follow whatever you put in the GoFundMe profile once you receive those funds. But you don't have to pay it back. So, so crowdfunding, great place to start. Google, great place to start.
Okay. Yeah, and I honestly, because I'm not in this loop, I would never think about there being like anywhere where I could get notifications for grants. Like I have a lot of connections amongst people who, work with community organizations and stuff, but these are pieces that I've never gotten into before. So, it's all new to me, which is why I'm really excited about the fact that you're teaching grant writing. I'm like, all right, I can apply this in a lot of different ways. This is a weird question too, though. If you don't have to pay something back, then what is the criteria for using that money? Are there benchmarks that you're expected to meet? Like I think about usually scholarship money is just given and then you kind of you use it to pay for your books, you use it pay for your tuition. Do you have to report back to a grant funder, or I mean, is it different for different groups, or?
It is different. So again, it depends on the funder. But essentially, whatever that you write up, either on your crowdfunding page or in the grant application, and this is what you say that you're going to do based on the needs. Whatever you say you're going to do, if you're awarded, that becomes a contract. So they're expecting you to do what you say you're going to do. And so the funder, usually they'll have guidelines on their website on what they will fund, because that also varies, but also what level of reporting would be required. So larger grants, for example, I help to manage a large federal education grant, and we have to report twice a year, annually. But for classroom grants, you may have to either report maybe at the end of the project, because usually they last for about a year. Or they may not require you to report at all. They may just want you to send a thank you note, and show the impact. Maybe a few pictures with whoever the target group receive those materials or something like that. So it really varies by funder. But yes, just for general practices, you definitely should keep track of your expenses. Regardless if you have to, do a report or not. And then it's helpful for you to refer back to what you put in your grant a couple of times throughout the project, just so you're not forgetting any of the activities in your timeline, so to speak. So yeah, it becomes a contract. You should keep up with receipts and things of that nature, and documentation, and then you'd have to refer to the funder's guidelines on reporting requirements.
So that makes me think of something else too. I mean, obviously there's huge value in data collection. Data is a commodity these days. I mean, if you're able to collect and randomize or, anonymize data, then it has value. Is that a positioning point you can put yourself in terms of getting a grant for something, is to be able to report back aggregated data or impacts? Is that, I mean, I'm just trying to.
So when you are creating your grant project, you definitely want to have some type of measurement outcome, right, or evaluation. So how do you know if your project was successful? How do you know that your learners learn X, Y, and Z, or so that should be embedded in your project for sure. And collecting that data and keeping up with that data could help support you in writing a future grant. So for example, when I grant write for an organization, usually we tend to focus on a few areas, and we'll continue to write grants for those areas. And then if there's a project that we're working on based on what we've done in the previous grant and lessons learned, we'll extend the project in some kind of way, scale it, improve it, and go after a grant. So we're not just, trying to find new stuff all the time. We're really refining what we have based on data.
Okay, so you might be able to get a grant year after year, potentially, based on the performance you had the year before.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, that's something I hadn't thought of either. I'm just thinking, okay, every year you're having to reset and find new grant funders. But again, like an unknown for me. I tend to try to look for opportunities these days for where you can collect data, specifically about particular populations. You talk about boys and how boys learn, and I'm sure there's a lot of information out there, but we want to continue to understand, how certain demographics of our population respond. So, interesting. Yeah. And it's, one of the things that I saw as well is that, there's criteria that has to be met for some of the school grants too, such as, and I was surprised to see this, but I guess maybe in retrospect not, that for some schools to apply, that they have to qualify for a certain percentage of free lunches. That I guess kind of automatically sets them up for a qualification for certain grants. So, again, things I hadn't really thought about. Can you tell us about some of the things that you've been able to fund with grants? I mean, what projects you've been able to work on?
All types of things. So as a classroom teacher, as I mentioned, like those books for boys, I also had another project called Speak Up Loud and Proud. So it was a project to help encourage students to public speak in front of the classroom. So we bought like little microphones and things like that, so they have like a more formalized experience. And that's tied to standards. Did another grant project, I think, to get some materials for STEAM, for robotics club that I was a facilitator for. And now writing grants for my own small business for COVID relief. Wanted to support like a STEAM-based program that immerses both teachers and students in project-based STEAM learning online. So there's a variety of things, and then I also manage grants as well. So federally funded grants, foundation grants. You know, it just runs the gamut. So yeah, I've definitely put all my experiences and gems and perspectives that I have in the whole grant life cycle, whether it's from writing a grant to reviewing grant applications to creating requests for proposals to managing grants into the book, just to give people a great place to start and to connect to what they already know how to do.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm thinking in terms of teachers, it's like, you know, teachers are already doing everything. So
Exactly.
carving out the time
You're
to
right.
learn how to do this and to take the time to grant, right? If you can sort of shorten that process for them a little bit or give them some nuggets, you know, on like what their benchmark should be, to me, that's a big deal. You know, if they know that they can, you know, structure 2 or 3 sentences that, you know, summarizes the need and what they plan to do with something, you know, and you've taken that behemoth of, oh my God, how am I going to do this, and boiled it down to something that they can handle in maybe an evening,
Right.
like in free time. That's a big deal. So interesting. I'm just, what about like travel and stuff like that? Because you mentioned that you travel, and we talked about the value of travel, and I
Mhm.
know that schools do things like that. You know, when we're ever back together and have travel again, and I'm very hopeful on this. Can you get grants for things like travel, or I
It's a
mean,
possibility. It's a possibility for sure. Even when I was an educator, I did write my own professional learning grant, and I had an opportunity to go visit a couple of schools in Toronto, Canada,
okay,
and that was based off of an educator grant. So yeah,
okay,
there's grants for almost any and everything. It's just a matter of finding them and meeting the requirements for them. Mm-hmm.
what about public companies? Like, you know, I mean, the big guys, the Microsofts, the Amazon, do they have grants for education as well?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that we mentioned actually in the first chapter of 12 Quick Steps is that we break down like where you can get grants from. And
Mm-hmm.
so we talked about like at the federal level, the state level, and then foundations and nonprofits. And a lot of corporations, they have a foundation. And
Okay.
so corporations will take maybe a small percent of their profits and roll that over into a foundation that
Okay.
does for social responsibility and giving back to the community. So
Okay.
absolutely. So places like Walmart, like you
Okay.
said, Microsoft, Google, here in the South, Chick-fil-A, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, Coca-Cola, all those major corporations have a nonprofit arm that more than likely give out grants. Now, you'd have to check to see if you meet the requirements for the grants, but
Sure.
they do. They absolutely do.
Okay.
That's a great question.
So that might be something I could do to start then, is look for like a foundation
Hmm.
for some of the major corporations that might be better funded in that way. Not that they're the only groups that we're going to find, but I'm just, again, like, you know, like if I want to look for a job, I mean, I'm probably going to look at LinkedIn. You know, I might look at Indeed, which, you know, I mean, there's all these different services, but I literally would be like completely lost when it came to the concept of, you know, how do I find a grant or apply for a grant? So do you normally do this on your own, or do you have others who help you put it together?
That's a
So
great question.
you're
So
pretty good. So I
that's a great question.
activity.
Right. Yeah. I'm always a proponent of a team effort. So if you're a classroom educator and you're going after it alone, that's one thing. But
Okay.
you would definitely want to have somebody to
Okay.
proofread your proposal before you submit it
Okay.
in. So in that way, it's still like a small team. If you're going after grants for a small business or for a school or school district, you definitely should have a team. You should definitely have a team. So definitely more than one person. Sometimes that's not an option, but I would recommend having a team, because then you can divide up the sections. Maybe you can have somebody to proof it at the end who hasn't been caught in the weeds of preparing it. Someone can check to see if you're answering the questions that the funder had proposed. So yeah, all those things. And another thing to be mindful of is that I'm sharing here is, so not only looking for the grants, but what are your needs first? So when you start to look for funding, you're looking for those foundations that align with your mission. So there are a lot who are interested in student education, right? There are some who are interested in literacy. There are others who are interested in maybe social and emotional well-being. So if you know what your need is first, it will help to narrow your search when you start to look for funders.
Okay.
And you're not stretching yourself thin, like, oh yeah, well maybe I can, it's like, just keep it simple. And then find the funder, and that'll help narrow down your search. And the other question is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, that's actually super helpful. So thank you.
And then are you ready for a grant, right? Are you in the best position to acquire a grant? And so what I have here special for all the TLD cast members that are here today is that you all can get a free grant readiness checklist. And it's like 10 simple questions. You can ask yourself, check them off. And again, you can use this really regardless if you're a classroom educator or you're working for a nonprofit or you're supporting a school or whatever. The basis of these questions will resonate for those different areas.
And that checklist is available on your BK Consulting website?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed Molly's asking a couple of questions. Molly had actually put a grant writing, it looks like a site up there. Yeah, and actually, so she's asking, should you include your grant requests within your pitch deck? And I know Molly's actually worked with building a startup, and then she asked, can you modify or update the said contract just needs to be adjusted due to unforeseen circumstances? Oh, I mean, like COVID?
Right. Those are great questions. So,
yeah.
Right. So, Molly, I'm glad you asked that, because a pitch deck is essentially the same questions in a grant application. It's essentially the same thing. So, if you are working for a small business or a startup and you have a pitch, usually your pitch is to investors, right? And so that whole sense in itself, you're looking for funding, you're acquiring funding, and you start off with a need. What need are you solving with your startup? And so there's a lot of parallels there with grant writing and the pitch deck.
Right.
So
and everything else.
That's
okay.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, and it's something I hadn't really thought about. I mean, and I've worked with people who've done pitches, but I was thinking, they're like, what pain point are we trying to solve? Well, it's the same process, right?
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, I was just thinking too, and Molly, thank you for asking that question, because what if you're midway between, a grant in your reporting and you're utilizing this money, and then oh my gosh, the world goes boom, like it did in February of last year, and all of a sudden you've got other scenarios to deal with. So, I would assume that you have to make some adjustments in how you're using the money. Oh, interesting.
And I'll re-put the link in there. Let me see if I have it. And then there was a second question that Holly asked that I want to answer. Can you modify or update the said contract if down the road the process needs to be adjusted? So in that case, usually with some of the larger grants, you would have to, usually you should be given like a point of contact for that grant. And so you would have to connect with whoever that person is and let them know, like, hey, this is what we originally agreed to do. Due to XYZ unforeseen circumstances, we need to modify our plan. Is that okay? And they will let you know if you can make those changes or not. And so it's good to stay in communication with who they have different names. So whoever your maybe contract officer is, or point of contact at the funder.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, but that happens, right? Life happens, and so you would have to ask them if it's okay before you just go and make the change, because you don't want to be out of compliance.
Okay.
Thank you,
Yeah, it sounds
Louise.
like it's too for our jobs. I mean, I think about the fact that we manage money and have to report to, our sources, even in our daily jobs. If we're going to change if we're going to change how we're going to spend money or a time frame or something. And again, it's always about managing the expectation and communicating, right? You just have to be a really good communicator to do this. So that's pretty cool. Okay, Louise said that the link works. Yay.
Okay, thank you. I used the wrong initial link. I used TinyCC and TinyURL, and I got them confused. Sorry. Thank you for that catch.
Oh, yeah. No, it's okay. We get past all of our little technical difficulties. So we're getting close to our time here. How can someone reach you, and how can they find the book? I mean, I'm really curious. Like, I know that you're teaching classes as well. If somebody wants to do a little bit deeper dive and learn with you on about grant writing, and I promise you, we won't drive you crazy. But how can people reach out to you to ask questions?
No, please do.
So,
I am happy to help, and I'm here to help. And so here are some of my socials. So I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as YouTube at BK Consultancy. And then I just finally emerged to Instagram.
oh wow.
Yeah, I know. It's been a long time. It's like, why is it taking so long? And so I'm at BK_consultancy on Instagram. And so yeah, so you can go there. You can go to the website. We have information about those grant writing courses where I'll actually coach you in 3 weeks on unpacking the book and how to write a grant in 3 weeks, pretty much. This year we'll also be releasing an asynchronous course, so you can take it, in your own place and space. And then of course you have the book. The book is on Amazon.
Okay.
Super easy. Thank you, Molly.
Okay.
Super easy to access. And if you happen to be a Kindle Unlimited holder, you can get an ebook copy for free. So trying to make it available and affordable for all those sharing these gems.
Oh, it's definitely affordable. I mean, I mean, it's a really good resource, and I'm working on some projects right now for some things that I'm volunteering with, and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, this is like such a great resource. But what really blows me away? Well, first off, the amount of money that teachers are spending for classrooms, because most of them don't make enough. There's a few places where the teachers make decent salaries, but not in most of the U.S. they don't.
That's correct.
Waste at $400 billion. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, seriously, I'm blown away by the fact that there's that much money available, and I'm sure some of it goes unclaimed because nobody knows it's there. So,
right. Or they tend to give it maybe to the same people who applied that do know about it, right? So yeah, let's get into that. Let's get a piece of that.
Yeah, absolutely. No kidding. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this today. Like I said, it's a little bit different from some of the things that we normally do, but I like to have guests on who talk about other things that we do. We're pretty much all instructional designers in some capacity, so we talk a lot about that. And right now, because especially because of COVID, not like this hasn't been in existence before, but we have a lot of needs where students and teachers are concerned, and they do the heavy lifting, to get our kids educated. I mean, I think about how it was when my kids were young, and I spent a lot of time with them, but I also worked full time. And I can't even begin to fathom what it must be like to be a single parent with a couple kids in the house, trying to do your job and help someone with homeschool. So, I mean, my hearts go out to them. So.
My hat's off, my heart, like you said, yes, absolutely, it goes out.
And the ones that are teaching in the classroom, I mean, the huge risks that they're taking as well. So, if we can get some grant money for even things to help make them safer in the classroom, I mean, that's a big deal. So. Cool. Well, this has been awesome. And everybody, thanks for jumping in and joining us today. And certainly, reach out to Bejanae if you need help. And she's actually really quick to respond to things. I know I'll send her an email. She'll send me something right back. So.
That's what I said. I'm here to help.
Okay. Well, everybody have a great day and take care.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Friday.